Becomes story time.
Yeah, I'm kidding. Maybe I could just read a chapter out of this. It'd be way better than Mike. I hope you enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the events coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory, land of the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis Nation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening with Rob Vanstone. Just before we begin, if you could all please be aware that this event is being live streamed, so just mind the camera off to your right up at the front here. And I'd also like to take this moment to remind you all to silence your cell phones if you haven't done that already. Okay, as many of you are probably already aware, Rob Vanstone is the Saskatchewan Roughriders senior journalist and historian. Before joining the football team in February of 2023, he spent 36 years with the Regina Leader Post, most notably as the sports editor and sports columnist. His work also appeared here in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Brave Face is Rob's fourth book and his first about hockey. His previous 3 books were about the Roughriders, including the best-selling 100 Things Roughriders fans should know and do before they die. In 2022, he received the WHL's Bob Ridley Award for Media Excellence, and last October, he was inducted into the Regina Sports Hall of Fame. Everyone, please give Rob a warm welcome.
Thanks, Jasper. Nobody's thrown anything yet. This is good. I'd like to start off by thanking McNally Robinson for doing this. Not only this function specifically, but we're so lucky. Hi, Bob. Hi, Linda. Hi, Don. Closer. We're so lucky that as writers and as readers, or in some cases both, we have an establishment like this. I guess we're done. Let's go have coffee. Just 1, 2. We're so lucky to be able to have a bookstore like this, a haven for readers and a bit of a landing spot for writers. There aren't many left, not just in Saskatoon or Regina or Saskatchewan, Canada, but in North America. I think anywhere you go to find a bookstore like this it's a treasure, and it's harder to find every year. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Jasper and everybody at McNally Robinson for making some time tonight, especially for everyone for coming. I really I'm grateful for this because I know I'm opposite the Stanley Cup playoffs and maybe a Bulgarian cricket game on satellite streaming or wherever you find that. So I'm going to keep this pretty informal. I'm not much of a public speaker, so I'll just tell you a little bit about nothing really that interesting. And if you'd like to ask any questions, feel free. The kind of the impetus for this was when my book on maskless goalies came out. So I contacted McNally Robinson. Jasper was so nice.
Got a backup microphone. We're going to switch to that.
Remember Al Kabong? We used to just hit me. I feel like a singer. Favorite requests? Melancholy Baby. Where do I put this? Or do I just hold it?
Yeah, just
no, I really have to wing it. It was really a neat experience being able to do that book because when you're I'm a 7-year-old kid. I remember just being fascinated by goalies, and I could not believe back in 1971 that a goalie would not wear a mask, and how that all ultimately morphed into a book on this topic still floors me. And I'm just looking at that. I'm so just honored to have done that. And the same publisher, Triumph Books, in 2019 approached me about doing 100 Things Roughriders fans should know and do before they die. And that was the last time I was up here at McNally Robinson doing a signing. And that was November of 2019. And it kind of blows me away because between then and now, my mom passed away 3 weeks later. Then I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Then we had a global pandemic. Then I lost 109 pounds, regained 70 of them, and changed jobs and got a dog. So it's been a very eventful 5 years since I last stood here. So I don't really have a lot to say. If there's any questions you would like to pose, it would be my pleasure to answer them as best I can. So, yes, Brian.
How did Bob Cole impact you growing up?
Well, I remember, this is really making me sound old, but growing up, we didn't get a lot of hockey. When I started watching hockey, we only had two TV stations, and CTV, which was Channel 6, Channel 2 in Regina, and CBC, which was Channel 9. And we used to get, on Saturday night, we would get Hockey Night in Canada on CBC. And for a while on Wednesday nights, we'd get a game on CTV. And then the Wednesday night game disappeared. So for the longest time, we got one hockey game a week. But on Sunday nights, CBC Radio used to have a game. And Bob Cole did that game. So my introduction to Bob Cole was listening to him on the radio. And I still think of him first and foremost, even though he called who knows how many games on television. I think of him as the Sunday night radio guy because that was one of the few windows we had to the National Hockey League in this cable televisionless outpost in Canada called Saskatchewan. And so that was really the interesting thing to me was I still kind of cling to that. And that was sort of in the era where I was getting to know hockey, getting into hockey as well. And those were when Bob Cole was doing those games way back when, there were still maskless goaltenders. And he did the radio call for Game 8 of the Summit Series between Canada and Russia on September 28, 72. And when Bob passed away, a lot of people played that call, and we're so used to hearing the Foster Hewitt version. Henderson has scored for Canada. It was really neat to hear the Bob Cole version that we don't often hear, but that's the one I heard. I was in grade 3 at Massey School, one of the 15 years I was in grade 3 at Massey School. And this is Jackson's class. And so many people have recollections of Game 8 of seeing it on TV. I didn't see it on TV. At Massey School, they typed the radio broadcast through the public address system. And it was so long ago that even the radio broadcast was in black and white. That was an attempt at humor. And I think the speaker was black and the wall was white. So, and so my Paul Henderson goal was Bob Cole through the speaker in Mrs. Jackson's class in grade 3 at Massey School. And, those of us, by Dawn, who are old enough to remember that one, really have an attachment to that game in that series. And Bob Cole was a really, part of that for me. I wish I'd met him. So many people have talked so admiringly of him, and rightfully so. And I've met a lot of hockey broadcasters. I interviewed a few of them for this book, Kelly Rudy, a lot of people who were on broadcast teams with Bob Cole, but I never had the opportunity to meet him, and I feel like I missed out on something.
What was the most interesting thing you learned researching this book?
Oh my God, who the final maskless goalie is. Because it's a really nerdy thing, but Ariel, me. I was partially hired by the Roughriders because I'm a nerd. But there had been a debate going on in hockey circles about, for the longest time, and hockey researchers, who is the last maskless goalie? And it came down to, most commonly, Andy Brown or Gay Cooley. Chapter 16, Gay Cooley is awesome. And and I was trying to resolve that question, and I thought I had. Andy Brown played his last game for the Indianapolis Racers in November of 1976, suffered a back injury, never played again. Andy Brown was just a classic character who used to race cars, and he taught his dog how to answer the phone. I have not yet mastered that with my dog. And she's taught me a lot of things, though. And so I was always in the, is it Brown, is it Cooley, is it Brown, is it Cooley? Well, it turns out Andy Brown was maskless in his last game in November 76 with the Indianapolis Racers. Now, the debate was, Gay Cooley had retired before the 76-77 season, but he came out of retirement because a bunch of their goalies got injured. He played again for 3 games with the Charlotte Checkers of the Southern Hockey League. But the debate was, did Gay Cooley wear a mask for that game? He had, late in his career, kind of been back and forth. He started wearing a mask, but sometimes after the first period, he'd just say, well, it's too hot, or I'm not playing well. And he'd take the mask off, put it on the back of the net. So sometimes he wore the mask, sometimes he didn't. But the question I had to resolve was, for any of those 3 games in December of 76 for the Charlotte Checkers that Gay Cooley wear a mask. If he did, Andy Brown is the last maskless goalie. And I struck out. I couldn't find any documentation anywhere. I sent an email to the Charlotte Public Library, and they had, just per chance, a photo of the final game that Gay Cooley ended up playing. And you can see in the background, there's a defenseman in front. You can see in the background, Gay Cooley in net with wearing a mask. So I thought, okay, I've got it resolved. But then I got an email from somebody who was at a World Hockey Association game in February of 1978. And he said that a goalie named Wayne Rutledge, who was the first goalie in the history of the Los Angeles Kings, and that he, for a portion of the third period, didn't wear a mask. And he was at that game, and he was at the game with his son, and he even took a picture, and he met Wayne Rutledge after the game. I ended up being able to verify this. And so I thought that was cool, that one debate that I thought had come down to 2, it turns out actually to be Wayne Rutledge. Lynn Zimmerman, the Houston Aeros starting goaltender for that game, had some kind of equipment problem, had to come to the bench. The referee said, let's get on with this. So Wayne Rutledge kind of rushed into the game. And even though he'd been wearing a mask routinely, he thought he was just going to be in the net for a few minutes, goes into the game without a mask, and then finishes the game. It goes into overtime. And so he was the last maskless goalie in hockey history, or in North American hockey history anyway. So, and Andy Brown had the dog who could answer the phone. Wayne Rutledge's dog Bear once ate a string of Christmas lights while they were plugged in. So that's one of the coolest things. How do you do that? My wife's tried to feed me the string of Christmas lights several times. That's why my hair's falling out. So that was a long answer. Sorry. Hi.
What did your parents say when you said you wanted to be a sports writer?
They could not have been more encouraging or enabling. At my dad's funeral in June of 1982, 42 years almost, and it was mentioned by the eulogist that this is what I was going to be, and even I didn't believe it at the time because it just seemed too far-fetched, right? I mean, it's always what I wanted, but it just seemed so utopian that I just figured, no, I'm just going to get my goal at the time was to get a math degree. And I didn't even think that it was possible. It just seemed so outlandish. But mom and dad kind of did it without even expressly, they never said to me, this is what you're going to do. But mom took me to football games right from the start. And I probably told this story too much, but I was born in 1964 and I went to my first football game in 1963. His mom was pregnant. She was in a little miracle game against Calgary out here. So mom and I went to 5 Grey Cups together. A relationship not unlike Don Rice and his mom. And football was our thing. We went on bus trips, on dash tours all over Western Canada. We were at Ronnie's last game in Edmonton in October of 78. And so mom I was doing my homework for all this. Well, I was neglecting doing my homework because I was skipping school to go on these big Grey Cup trips every year with mom. At the same time, dad was such a proponent of literacy and of reading. Dad was a big science fiction reader, and he loved Isaac Asimov. And I couldn't get enough. I couldn't read enough to keep up with my appetite for it. And dad was the same way. And dad worked at home as an architect. And if I wanted like a new toy or a train set or, a new dog or something, I really had to beg and squeal, and maybe it would happen. If I wanted something to read, everything would stop. And dad would come up and he would drive me downtown, circle the block. I don't know if anybody remembers the old Simpsons store in Regina. And dad would circle the block and I'd go to the second floor and just pretty much, he'd give me a $20 bill. And I would just basically get as much as I could for $20. And then dad would meet me with his station wagon. When's the last time you saw a station wagon? Yeah. And I parked mine outside and go home, and then dad would go down to the basement, resume doing his drawings, and I would read until I was all out of stuff. So dad instilled in me the love of reading, and mom instilled in me the love of sports, and particularly football. And my dad was also the organist for the Granite Pats from 71 to 74. So dad gave me my hockey fix as well, right? So it just kind of added up after a while. And there's other little, tangential stories, but that's pretty much the crux of it. I love sports, I love to write, I love to read, and I don't have any practical skills. So as Heather Paul's well knows, because you might work with me for way too long at the leadership post. That's really long. I think that answer was longer than my career. So anybody still conscious? Yes.
Who's the most interesting goalie you met in researching your book?
Oh, I loved Gay Cooley. I loved Gay Cooley. They were all so great. I feel kind of bad singling one out, but Gay Cooley, chapter 16. He was just so cool, as his nickname or as his surname would suggest. He was just one of the last maskless goaltenders, and just a absolutely compelling character and a great guy. And he told me one story where he got they were on a road trip, but he got hit in the face with a puck, and between periods he gets stitched up. And I don't know if you remember the old cartoon Andy Cap, where he used to have the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. Well, as Gay told me the story, he's got this team doctor trying to stitch him up between periods, and the guy is inebriated and he's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And Gay said to the doctor, enough of this, just tape me up and I'll finish the game. And then on the way home, we'll stop an emergency and I can get stitches. So that's exactly what happened. He finished the game with like tape around his head. And then the bus on the way out of town went to the hospital and he went in and got stitched up. The other element to the story is that Gay Cooley was the bus driver for the Charlotte Checkers. So there would be a lot of games he'd play and then get on the bus. And the bus driver at the time liked to play cards. So they'd be like 10 miles out of town, and the guys in the back playing cards would say, hey, Bussy, come back here. So he would leave, and as the bus was moving, Gay would slide in and keep driving the bus all the way back home. Like that's, and I mean, he was sort of an extra in slap shot. He told a story. He was playing in a minor league playoff game in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. At the time, Slapshot was being shot, and Paul Newman was in the audience. And they wanted to get some stock footage of just hockey games to use to make it look more convincing when the Hansons were out there wreaking havoc. So they had the Johnstown game in which Gay Cooley was participating, and Paul Newman's brother comes into the dressing room and hands all these waivers to the players so that they can sign the consent for their images to be shown. And everybody was signing it, and Gay Cooley was the one who wouldn't. And Paul Newman's brother said, is there a problem? He says, yeah, like we're not getting anything. Like, what's in it for us? And so Paul Newman's brother goes, and he leaves, comes back 2 minutes later with Paul Newman. And Paul Newman goes, is there a problem here? And Gay Cooley pipes up and says, yeah, like, what's going on here? Like we're being asked to sign something. What's in it for us? And Paul Newman goes, well, what do you want? Thinking they're going to ask for like a lot of money. He goes, case of beer for every player. Nope. And Paul Newman goes, that's it? And he goes, yeah, we're hockey players. So the Newmans got a bunch of cases of beer, and they opened up the luggage compartment at the bottom of the bus, and they put so much beer in the bus, they had to move some of the equipment in the bottom into the actual bus, which is probably being driven by Gay Cooley. And he was wonderful. They were all wonderful. Ian Young was really cool. He was a goalie with the Oshawa Generals. He was sort of supposed to be the next great Boston goaltender after Gerry Cheevers and Eddie Johnston. And he got hit in the left eye by a Mickey Redmond slap shot when Mickey Redmond was playing for the Peterborough Petes. And this prodigal goaltender's career was pretty much ended by a slap shot because he was playing barefaced in the Ontario Hockey Association in the mid-60s. And it was really neat to be able to catch up with Ian Young and hear his story. He went to be an immense success in business and life. He wrote 4 books on goaltending. He coached. He actually made a comeback and played university hockey, even though he only had one eye with full vision. And just a really cool guy. And I was also able to talk to Mickey Redmond and get his perspective on what it was like. And that was a really rewarding chapter because it was a story that really hadn't been told. It was really they both, you could tell both those guys really had a lot of affection and empathy for one another. And Mickey Redmond was a 50-goal scorer twice for the Detroit Red Wings in their 1970s, and his career ended pretty much at age 29 by a back injury. And so he too had to cope with the sudden end of a hockey career that should have had so many more years in it. He told me that when he had that back injury, he had to leave the game early. He really realized what Ian Young had to go through not even a decade earlier, just because of a slap shot that was, certainly not intended to do that, but it hit kind of a ice chip or something and just took a carried in a direction didn't expect. And hard to believe that goalies weren't wearing masks when Mickey Redmond was firing the puck, when Bobby Hull was firing the puck, when Boom Boom Jeffrey on. I mean, hard to believe. I'm still incredulous, and I spent a year and a half of my life writing that book and answering that question. So sorry about that. Yes. Yes, sorry, Donna.
That's all right.
Beat you by a split second.
Okay, who was the first professional as an NHL goalie to put on a mask?
It would have been Clint Benedict of the Montreal Maroons in the early 30s. And it's kind of a primitive looking thing. It just, this rubber thing that pretty much protects the cheekbones. And he got drilled in the face, and just for the sake of being able to get back sooner, he wore the protection. And then as soon as it was Howie Morenz actually of the Montreal Canadiens that hit him in the face, and legendary player. And then, but as soon as he could take the mask off, he did. And oddly enough, not long after that, he hit the face again, and his career was ended. He took the mask off, and it ended up costing him his career.
Well, there's a heritage moment though with Jacques Plante.
Yeah, Jacques Plante was the first. He was the first one that really crystallized it. Like Clint Benedict was like a few games until the face stopped swelling. But on November 1st, 1959, by that point, a lot of the goalies were wearing masks in practice. They called this one thing the lorch. It was almost like a welder's shield that was like clear plastic. And so a lot of goalies were wearing masks in practice, but not in games. And they felt that practices were more dangerous in games because they were going to face a lot more shots in practice than in games. Yeah. And there were no backup goalies back then. But sometimes the trainer or the equipment manager would be the backup goalie. There was only one roster spot allotted for a goalie. Lefty Wilson, who was the Detroit Red Wings trainer for the longest time, was also their emergency goalie. And if you look in the NHL hockey history, you'll find games played by Lefty Wilson, just sporadically, because that was all they had. There was no backup. So in practice, they would wear these masks, but nobody dared to wear it in a game. And the coaches, and the GMs, and the owners at the time would propagate the myth that goalies who wore masks were cowardly, that you couldn't see the puck at your feet, that their play would be adversely affected. There's only 6 jobs of that nature in the world. So I think from a self-preservation standpoint, not physically, but in terms of job preservation, goalies were reluctant to wear it in games. But Jacques Plante, as he generally was throughout history, was a trailblazer. And by the time it happened in November 1st, 59 in Madison Square Garden, the Canadiens were there playing the Rangers. And by that time, the Canadiens had already won 4 straight Stanley Cups, and Jacques Plante had won Vezina trophies. And he had enough, I think, clout to be the guy who pulled it off or put it on. And so he got hit by an Andy Bathgate shot in that game, and the debate raged for years whether it was intentional. And I think the consensus is that it was. He felt that Jacques had kind of done something untoward, and so he thought, well, I'll show him, and he shot the puck in his head. So he comes out of the game, and the game can't resume until Jacques Plante's back in the net, unless you want to put the trainer in or the mask on. And so that's where Jacques Plante took a stand, said to the Canadiens head coach, Toe Blake, I'm not going in without a mask. And he had taken the mask along on road trips and actually worn it in an exhibition game that year, but had not worn it in a regular season game. And he insisted that he would not go in unless he wore the mask. And then once he did, the Canadiens' streak of prosperity eventually swelled to 13 straight games without a loss. So again, a lot of those myths were dispelled. He wore the mask one more late in the regular season. I don't know, and nobody was really sure why, but he took it off one more time toward the end of the regular season, and then put it back on. And then gradually they started coming around. Not fast, but within a few weeks, there were minor league goaltenders who were wearing the mask. And then the second one was Don Simmons of the Boston Bruins. And then in 1962, Terry Sawchuk went on. Gradually, it started coming. But Jacques Plante was the first that really made it stick. Clint Benedict was not long. There was a Olympian in 1936 who wore the mask, and arguably to protect his glasses. So you're a little episodic instances of goalies not wearing masks, but there was nothing with any permanency or longevity until Jacques Plante.
And that style of mask became kind of the standard in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it was designed by Bill Birchmore, who worked for Fiberglass Canada at the time, and he had been tinkering with this thing and actually approached Jacques Plante. And Jacques liked the idea. And then very quickly there were modifications to that mask. It almost looked like they called it the pretzel mask. And it looks like it's providing basically no protection. But the initial Birchmore mask morphed into the pretzel mask. And then Terry Sawchuk, I mentioned Lefty Wilson, the Detroit trainer, he also designed masks on this side. So there was a mask that was known as a Lefty Wilson mask. And whereas the Jacques Plante mask kind of had a square mouth and lots of holes,
right,
the Lefty Wilson mask had lots of straight lines. And again, it doesn't look like it provided much protection. So for the longest time, there was the Birchmore mask, and there was the Lefty Wilson mask. And eventually, Jacques Plante designed his own mask, and it became a very popular. If you look at Bernie Perron with the 74-75 Stanley Cup winning Philadelphia Flyers, that was the Jacques Plante mask, and that one stuck until a hybrid was concocted in the late 70s, kind of a hybrid of the cage, which was kind of coming into vogue, and the fiberglass, which as years went by protected more of the entire head.
Yes.
And so Dave Dryden wanted a kind of a composite of that, and he designed they call it the cage combination mask, and that is pretty much what you see today on goaltenders with some modifications. That was Dave Dryden, who doesn't get nearly enough credit as a hockey innovator.
Who's Dave Dryden?
Ken's brother.
Oh, okay.
And Dave was actually going to write. He proofread the book for me. He passed away not long before it came out. Dave Dryden was just an amazing guy. I actually dedicated the book in part to him. And you talk to him, it's like talking to Ken. The voice is the same, everything's the same. Dave Dryden doesn't get enough credit among, I think, the hockey community for just being as amazing as he was and influential as he was. I would argue just as much as Jacques Plante or some of the early ones. You look at that cage combination mask that came up in the late 70s in conjunction with a designer named Greg Harrison. And we're pushing 45, 46, 47 years now where there's been evidence of that mask. That's a pretty amazing. Dave Dryden and Ken Dryden were the first brothers to play against each other in an NHL game as goaltenders in 71. So
what team did Dave play with?
He played for Buffalo at the time. He was one of the first backup goaltenders. Glenn Hall had been the guy in Chicago for a while when there was just one goalie. He played 502 consecutive games and without a mask. And then it was a year or two before expansion. Rosters were expanded to allow for a backup goalie. And Dave Dryden was one of the first backup goalies. And he ended up with Buffalo in the expansion draft. Ended up playing for the Edmonton Oilers. Well, he played against the Oilers for the Indianapolis Racers of the World Hockey Association. And he allowed Wayne Gretzky's first goal. Actually, Gretzky scored 2 goals that night on Dave Dryden, who was the winning goaltender that night. In 1978, with the Indianapolis Racers, the Oilers came in and played Gretzky. And then not long after that, Gretzky was traded to Edmonton. And not long after that, Dave Dryden ended up in Edmonton. Dave was on the bench for the Oilers when Gretzky scored his first NHL goal in October of the following year against Vancouver. Eddie Mio was the Oilers starting goaltender, but Dave Dryden allowed Gretzky's first goal in professional hockey and saw his first goal in the NHL. So how fluky is that? Again, another 48-minute answer. It's time for breakfast yet? Are you serving muffins or anything?
There's for you.
Hi, Don. Sorry, you're still on. I thought that one was going to be
I'm switching to football now.
anesthetic for everybody.
Who is your favorite rider player to interview, and who is your favorite coach to interview?
Oh my goodness. My favorite rider player ever is Joey Walters. Love Joey. Favorite rider player to interview, Ronnie. Ronnie was just great. You know, I mean, you've got some of the books, including one with Ronnie in the cover. Ronnie was just everything, and his memory was so precise about everything, and his stories were always so funny and so insightful. And he loved to tell stories. when I interviewed him for the 66 Rider book, we chat, and I can still remember his wife Bev. I could hear her in the background. I was talking to him over the phone. He was at home in Grimsby, Ontario, and I could hear Bev calling him for supper. I'll be okay. I'll be a couple of minutes. A half hour later, he'd still be telling stories. Right? It was just, and Ronnie has my favorite football quote of all time. He said, "It is said that the wind blows in Saskatchewan in the spring, winter, and summer, and Lancaster blows playoff games in the fall." Ronnie loves that joke. Favorite coach? Ken Austin is always so good. If you asked Ken Austin a question that engaged him, which was tough because he was so smart, like it was tough to ask a question that really correlated with his intellect, because he was just a genius and still is. But if you've got Ken Austin with a question that he really liked, he would start answering it before you were finished, because he just wanted to snap it out of the air and nail it. And it was such an exhilarating thing as a writer when you knew that you'd come up with a topic that he really liked, because you knew it was basically going to write your whole story for you. It was just great. Ken Miller was hilarious.
Yeah,
I loved dealing with Ken Miller. There were a couple of times he kind of plant questions with me. There was one time that the way it worked after practice is the players would be interviewed and then the coach would be interviewed. And I didn't generally need a lot of interviews. As a columnist, you don't need as many interviews as a regular beat reporter would require. It's not the nuts and bolts that I'm after. I'm more after in a perspective or just a different take. So I didn't need as many interviews. So what the routine often was that the players' interviews would be over. They'd still be going on when I was finished interviewing the players. And Ken Miller would be sitting on the bench waiting for it to be done. So I'd just go over and chat with him. And one day he told me about this letter that he'd gotten. And this was on a Monday or a Tuesday. And the Riders had just finished winning a game quite impressively, and Darian Durant had a great game. Well, this frustrated fan wrote a letter to Ken Miller late the week before, just criticizing Darian Durant. And so between the letter being mailed and Ken Miller reading it, Darian had thrown for 400 yards. It was great. So he tells me about this letter and this kind of fed me that one. So the scrum begins, the interview begins with Ken Miller, and I just said to him, what kind of feedback are you getting on Darian Durant lately? And then well, I'm glad you asked that, bro. And he was gold. Ken Miller was wonderful to deal with. And he loved a good joke. And he loved to have the punchline. And I was not at all opposed to setting him up for it, because it would make the article sing.
Sure.
When he just liked a good laugh. And there were times when I was kind of the straight man for that one.
Favorite current player?
I'm sorry?
Current player to interview.
Who did I last interview, Ariel? It keeps changing by the hour. Trevor Harris is just exceptional. And Ariel is the Roughriders director of communications. She's sitting with Sebastian Soltis, new communications assistant. And she knows Trevor, very well. And there just isn't a thing you can ask Trevor about that will not elicit an interesting answer. He just exudes perspective. It's just it's sort of like the Kent Austin thing, where you just know you're going to get all world material from him, and the better the question, the better the answer. But even if it's an uninspired question, Trevor is just so good. He's just absolutely exceptional. One of the best people I've ever interviewed, and one of the best interviewees I've ever been around. So, but it's tough because I can't say that there's been a bad experience or even a disappointing one interviewing since I joined the Roughriders on February 13th of last year at
Nice.
9:58 a.m. Thanks, Ariel. appreciate the game.
Chris Jones to interview.
I always liked Chris Jones.
Yeah, he was
And
good.
because he was just very candid. There were no cliches, and very, very to the point. And I don't know if the feeling was mutual, but I always enjoyed dealing with Chris Jones. I never walked away without a topic. And he came to Regina or Saskatchewan with a reputation of being really difficult with the media. We never saw that. It was really the only tough one. It was his first exhibition game at home in 2016. And my routine called me to stay in the press box, called for me to stay in the press box until and as soon as the game was over, I had to write a really quick story for leaderpost.com, and then I could go downstairs to the press conferences. So this story was like 4 or 5 paragraphs. Here's the score. Here's who did well. Thank you. Goodbye. And then we'd update it later with quotes. But they started a post-game coaches media conference a little earlier than I expected. And so I was a couple of minutes late for the first Chris Jones media conference at home. And this was at Old Taylor Field. And so I get there and the door is only partially open and I can hear Chris Jones talking. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to be as unobtrusive as possible. So I thought I'll just open the door really slowly, which was the stupidest thing I could have done because this thing needed oil more than my arthritic knee. So I opened the door slowly. I only kind of prolonged the agony of it all for myself and Chris Jones, because as he's speaking, suddenly and he's just glaring at me. And I was like looking at the ground. I didn't see it, but everybody said he was just shooting daggers at me as I made what should have been a quick door open. Sound like
The real failure was that after that, you closed the door. Not expeditiously. So made the noise opening and then you closed it.
I can handle that pretty well overall. That was the only disappointing. Actually, the Riders had their annual meeting about a week or two after that, and I approached him and I apologized for it, and we had a good laugh about it. So that at least there was closure there, and there was closure with the door.
Have you ever been banned from a locker room? Made
I've
you
been in situations where the media's been, there's been like the media can't come in, or there's certain restrictions placed on the media because of the something, there's really response to something been written or broadcast, but nobody's ever said you can't come in. McNally Robinson might say that. But sports teams, no, it's fingers crossed. If I am in the future, it'll be to the detriment of my job security, because the team we report on is the Riders now. Hi, Brian.
Hey, what's your thoughts on the growth of the PWHL?
Love it. So long overdue. You see everything that's happened with Caitlin Clark, and I just think it's so nice that the female sports are finally getting that type of recognition and that type of exposure and that type of support. You look at the TV ratings, look at the ticket sales, you look at the buzz. It's wonderful. I remember when I early in my career in the early 90s, I did a story on a female hockey player, and I thought that the on ice game for females was ringette. That's what females played back then by and large. And to see, it was a novelty to write a story about a female hockey player back then. And it's, when you look at it now, it's like, why couldn't this have happened in the 90s? Like at the time, it didn't really occur to me, but looking at it now and trying to put it in perspective, it's so unfortunate that it took so long. But there's not a lot to be gained by lamenting the past. I'm so glad this is happening now, and we've seen in the quality of play and the response to it and the kind of inspiration that's providing for young girls playing hockey. I'm really excited to see where this goes. I hope I'll live long enough to see not necessarily the culmination, but I just want to see where it gets close to the apex, because I think there's a lot of catching up to do, and it's all on fast forward now because people are realizing how great this is. I like watching it because I think it's closer to authentic hockey. I think it's closer to a version of the game that accentuates the most refined aspects of the game. The male game has evolved, if I can use that term, to the point where it's just dump, chase, muck, 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 and a lot of it's almost too fast for its own good. And you don't get to see, I think, the skilled elements of the game as much, because it's a lot of the time eradicated. It's just get pucks deep, get pucks deep. You watch a female hockey game and you see the true skill of the game being accentuated, and then the absolute joy with which they play, and the crowds know they're part of something really big, and it's only getting started, but it's a wonderful thing. It's one of the best things I've seen in most of a lifetime of following sports. I'm just elated with it. Yes, Don.
Since you're talking about different coaches, was John Gregory as good to talk to as it looked like his personality was?
I didn't cover the ride when John Gregory was there, but I talked to him quite a bit. And but the start, he was pretty volcanic. There was one early in one of the first games he ever coached, Nick Miliokas, who's a sports columnist for Leader Post, and he took exception to a question Nick asked and threw chalk at him. So, and they tried to form the way that game had gone, the chalk was incomplete. But he kind of mellowed over time. And if you look at the '89 Grey Cup, I think you saw the version of John Gregory that needed to exist for that team to be successful. You know, Bill Baker told me, Bill Baker was a general manager when John Gregory was hired. And early in his tenure, I think his volcanism was really something that Bill Baker thought was working to the detriment of the team, and they had to calm him down because there's sideline decisions to be made. And by the time the '89 Grey Cup came around, I think John Gregory, in his dealings with the media and his dealings with the officials, had, I think, evolved to the point where he was ready to coach a Grey Cup winning team. And I don't think he gets enough credit for it. I mean, this is a coach who took a 9-9 team and beat a 16-2 team in the West Final. And people forget that Hamilton was also favored to win that game. Hamilton was 12-6 that year. Riders were 9-9. And it was a lot closer to being a Hamilton home game than a Roughrider home game, that game being in Toronto. And, you know, John Gregory did a tremendous job of holding that team together because they had some turmoil near mid-season. And they had so many injuries. They had a slot back. They had a backup quarterback, Jeff Ventrum, returning kicks and actually starting at receiver in the West semifinal in Calgary. They had a 5'9" Jeff Treflin playing linebacker early in the season because the linebacking corps was decimated. They had so many things that went wrong. And John Gregory found a way to hold that team together and won the second Grey Cup in franchise history. And then within a year and a half, he had been let go. And I talked to Phil Kershaw not long ago. Phil was the president of the team when John Gregory was fired. He said that one of his regrets was that he said over time you kind of learn not to get caught up in the emotion of it. And I think over time, John Gregory was able to control his emotions, but I think it was a pretty volatile time in '91, and a lot of people felt that change was necessary. But in hindsight, even the president of the team wondered if the right decision was made to let John Gregory go. And but he ended up going to the arena football and prospering there. Was coaching in Europe into his late 70s, and enjoyed a long coaching career, and one that I think deserves a lot more commendation than it receives. And he's a terrific coach, a wonderful guy. Yes.
If you could cover one game from any time, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Probably my favorite game of all time, October 29th, '78. Ron Lancaster's last game at Commonwealth Stadium. I was 14. I was at the game. Mom and I went to Edmonton on dash tours. It was the Riders' last game of the year, and Ronnie, a week before, had been booed in his final appearance at Taylor Field. And because people pretty much conceded that Ronnie was going to be finished after that year, they brought in a quarterback named Larry Dick, who was a rookie. And they had started Larry Dick and Ronnie's last game at Taylor Field. Ronnie came in at the end, threw an interception. Crowd didn't take to it very well. And so the next game in Edmonton, Larry Dick started, actually played pretty well. But by the fourth quarter, the offense had kind of stalled, and the Edmonton fans were chanting for Ronnie. They wanted to see him play one more time. There were banners hung up in that Commonwealth Stadium. Thank you, Ronnie, for all the good years. It was just a love-in for Ron Lancaster. And the home team was basically the away team for the climactic portions of that game. People wanted to see Ronnie in the game. So he comes in the game with about 10 minutes left. Larry Highbaugh, an Edmonton defensive back, shook hands with Ronnie on his way to the huddle. And Ronnie said afterwards, Well, he should have shook my hand. With all the interceptions I threw him, he put him in the Hall of Fame. I like him to be wrong. And so Ronnie comes in, quickly throws a touchdown pass to Joey Walters to tie the game. Bob McAreedy hit a convert. The Eskimos, Jim Germany fumbles. Ken McEachern pounces on the ball. And Ronnie throws his final completion to Brian O'Hara down to the 1 yard line and then sneaks it in for the final touchdown. So in Ronnie's final game, a week after things did not go the way he liked it, his final game at home, he comes off the bench in Edmonton and Riders win 36-26. And it's a love-in. The Eskimo, they used to have a fire truck that went around the perimeter of Commonwealth Stadium after the Eskimos scored a touchdown. And there was a big, it was all, they celebrated the Saskatchewan touchdown with the Edmonton truck going around the field. And the crowd was just, it was a wonderful, I've never seen anything like it. Not only for it to end, his career to end the way it did, but for that to happen a week after things that unfolded as they did in Regina. And then you consider the fact that he was a visiting player being treated like a local hero. It was beautiful. It was my favorite sporting event ever, until hopefully this November when the Riders win a Grey Cup. Well, then we'll give that the silver medal. So
Didn't Lancaster go on to coach the Eskimos?
he ended up coaching here for in his first 2 years after not playing. He coached in 79 and 80, and then stepped down after that. Was at CBC as a broadcaster. Actually, was a broadcaster at the I think the '84 Olympics for CBC, doing color commentary for basketball.
Wow.
But that's something. And then he ended up joining CBC as part of the coverage team. And then in '91, he was hired by Edmonton as the head coach. And Hugh Campbell, who'd been his favorite target, hired Ronnie as the head coach. So he went on to be very successful in Edmonton. Won a Grey Cup in '93. Went to Hamilton. Won a Grey Cup in '99.
And then Hamilton never won one since.
Hasn't won one since. So it's really amazing how that. I mean, Ronnie started off here back-to-back 2 and 14 seasons, and was so successful ultimately that he ended up with a winning record as a head coach. And Ronnie also basically realized that things needed to be torn down and built up here. That team had gotten old, and they couldn't replace Ronnie. And so they basically created a young offensive line, and really, Ronnie he really was willing to take the lumps in order to rebuild this team. And but by the time the team started winning games, he was already the former head coach of the Roughriders, but he ended up doing so extraordinarily well in broadcasting and in coaching. And I don't think anybody in CFL history has done more when you consider the entire package. Ronnie as a player, Ronnie as a broadcaster, Ronnie as a coach. When you consider Ronnie as an ambassador, when you consider everything, the entirety of what he did, like there's nobody like Ronnie.
He was an import player, though. Right?
Yeah, or born in Fairchance, Pennsylvania, but actually grew up in Clareton, Pennsylvania, and came up, played at Wittenberg College, and then went to the Ottawa Roughriders, and then after 3 years in Ottawa, was traded here. And the odd thing was, in '59, the Riders fired George Turlop, the head coach, at mid-season. George Turlop ends up going to Ottawa as a general manager, and it was George Turlop who brought Ronnie to the Canadian Football League. So the Riders hadn't fired George Turlop in '59. Does Ronnie end up in Ottawa the following year? And Ronnie's coach at Wittenberg College was a guy named Bill Edwards, who was the godfather to Bill Belichick. So how's that? Wow. Steve Belichick and Bill Edwards were dear friends. And Bill Belichick was a guest coach at the Riders training camp in '58. So there's more Bill Belichick trivia than nobody asked for.
Tell the story about Ronnie getting the number 23.
Well, he didn't really choose it. They just kind of said to him, the equipment manager, Hinckley Archer at the time, said, here's number 23. And Ronnie kind of said, well, isn't that an odd number for a quarterback? Quarterbacks were traditionally below 19 or below, and often in single digits. He said, I'll just take 23, and you won't be here that long anyway. And the reason 23 was available, they had a quarterback in '62 named Dave Surratt, who was a big star at Boston College. And Dave Surratt and Bob Toczek were the Riders quarterbacks in '62. And then the things being as they were in the States in 62, Dave Surratt at the end of the 62 season was called to serve in the United States Army. So 23 was available because Dave Surratt, who was probably returned to the Riders in 63, if not for Army obligations. And if they had Dave Surratt, maybe they don't trade for Ron Lancaster. So thank you to Uncle Sam for that one. Anybody still conscious? I've done it again, haven't I? Great. Well, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna ask you about who's your favorite sports columnist from the past, like, I mean, with the Leader Post.
Bob Hughes. Oh, I loved Bob Hughes. I mean, he was like another dad to me. I grew up reading Bob. He was just the absolute best. If you read Bob's stuff now, it still holds up as being great. Bob had an innate, intuitive understanding of what people were talking about, and he just knew he understood the pulse, and then he would just write it perfectly. Bob was never during his time as the Leader Post sports call, the 72 to 88. Bob never missed. It was just unbelievable. There were days when I was slumping and I would just go into the library of the Leader Post, pull out the Bob Hughes scrapbooks and just read them, looking for trying to look for inspiration, hoping that some of that would rub off. It never did, except we had the same first name. But Bob was, he told me a story. I said to Bob once, we had an entire front page of the Leader Post with a letter from Gord Stasis, who was then the president of the team. And this letter did nothing but rip Bob Hughes to shreds about negative coverage. And he just went off on Bob, and it was on the front page of the sports section. And I've never seen that happen before. So one day I asked Bob about it. I said, do you remember the time that Gord Stasis wrote that letter to Gord? Do you remember the time Gord Stasis' letter appeared on the front page of the sports section? He goes, remember it? I helped him write the thing. Gord phoned Bob and said he wanted to kind of take issue with what Bob had written, and was kind of struggling, and said, well, come over here. So Gord Stasis came over to the Leader Post. They sat down, and Bob helped him write the 1,500-word letter that basically excoriated Bob Hughes. And it got read, and that was the name of the game. Bob got it better than anybody.
It's about selling newspapers.
I'm sorry?
It's about selling newspapers.
Yeah, and it was about just being authentic. And it was about, Bob dished it out. And if somebody wanted to, respond in kind, so be it. Bob Hughes hired me on July 31st of 87. And thanks to Ariel, I was hired again and started on February 13th of 2023. So those are the two people who've hired me, aside from washing dishes at the keg in 83 for a month. Bob Crow, Tom Morris.
I was going to ask you, do you think the reign of terror, one of Bob Hughes' coats, is over now for this recurrence?
I really do. The reign lasted for 11 years. Yeah. My best friend, Mark Anderson, Dr. Mark Anderson, used to be the principal at Luther College High School in Regina. Mark moved to Regina in 77 from Lethbridge. And he thought, oh, gee, Mark was 14 at the time. And Mark said, I love the CFL. He'd never lived in a CFL city before. One of the first things he did was get season tickets, 1977. And in 1988, Mark and I went to the first Rider playoff game Mark ever attended at home. 11 years.
It was cold.
That was a cold day.
Yeah, I wasn't there.
26,000 people. They didn't even sell at the stadium that day.
I was sitting on the edge of the stadium, BC Lions. Yeah, it was a cold day.
Tony Cherry ran wild. Yeah. And just, that was such a, but you know what? That game helped. If you look at 89, they remembered how terrible they felt in 88. And if you look through the years, in 66, the Riders remembered what happened in 65 when they lost 15-9 in Winnipeg. We remember the Cody Fajardo upright or the crossbar hit in 2019 in the West semifinal in Winnipeg in 65. Ronnie threw a pass to Jim Wharton in the end zone. It was pretty much open, and the ball hit the goalpost. So in 66, they remember what had happened in 65. In 89, they remember what had happened in 88. In 2007, one of the real motivating factors for the Riders is that they'd gone to BC for the West Final and got blown out. So the next year they went to BC and won 25-16. You look at 2013 and 2012, the Riders went to Calgary. Darian threw 4 touchdown passes, but they lost on a pass from Drew Tate to Romney Bryant. And it was 36-30 for Calgary, but they remembered. So every time the Riders won a Grey Cup, they had a heartbreak in a playoff game the previous year. And they remembered, you know, Oilers have always talked about how they remembered how it felt to lose to the Islanders in 83. And that was, I think, a lot of motivation for winning in 84. Sometimes you have to go through that. You know, sometimes you have to sit through a bad book signing to appreciate how good the next one was. So, good luck.
5 minutes.
5 minutes to live, or you can talk to my cardiologist. If there's any other questions, I'd be pleased to answer. If you'd like to hang around and chat, please buy lots of books because I need money to afford the tea that I need to buy. So the Billy Holiday one might also be played.
It's good.
Jasper's the Billy Holiday fan. Is it good?
It is good, yeah.
So thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor to spend time with you tonight. And thanks again for supporting this wonderful store. It's really, really neat to be here. So have a good great community.
Signing your books now or?
Absolutely.
Okay, wow. That's,
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, there are books up at the front here and some more books on the desk there.